Forces is playing a key role in the war in Afghanistan and the battle against terrorism. Now a shocking series of domestic murders at the base has some blaming a controversial drug soldiers are ordered to take. CBS News correspondent Cynthia Bowers has been investigating.
They were returning heroes. U.S. soldiers who'd been away from their families for months in Afghanistan, finally home. But at Fort Bragg, the hugs and kisses quickly turned to shock and sorrow when Master Sergeant William Wright and 2 other Special Forces soldiers allegedly murdered their wives over the course of 6 short weeks. Questions of a link quickly surfaced.
When I first heard about the soldiers at Fort Bragg, my first thought was Lariam.
The suspect soldiers reportedly all took Lariam, a drug given to troops serving in places where malaria is prevalent. But for all its effectiveness, Lariam has been linked to serious psychiatric side effects, including rage, aggressiveness, and suicidal thoughts. Army investigators aren't ready to make that connection, but they are considering dispatching a medical team to Fort Bragg to look into anything that may have contributed to the killings, including Lariam.
I don't think it's much of a link, if anything, but it may be a factor we'll look at possibly down the road.
Steve.
Jim Preach says they should. During his 29 years at the State Department, he often took anti-malarial medications without incident. But when he switched jobs, he was given Lariam for the first time. Within days, he says, the problems began.
I have had to control rage. I have had urges that have gone from jumping out a window to stepping in front of a fast-moving truck.
It's not just soldiers and diplomats taking Lariam. It's recommended by the government and prescribed to nearly 400,000 American travelers each year, many of whom may not be aware of the potential risks.
The most recent study showed that 29% of the people who take Lariam will suffer a neuropsychiatric side effect. That's a very, very high rate.
Sue Rose has collected thousands of side effect reports, many from U.S. troops who served in Somalia. They sometimes refer to the day they took their weekly dose of Lariam as Psycho Tuesday. And there are reports some soldiers in Afghanistan were taken off Lariam because of erratic behavior. William Wright's lawyer says the accused soldier's friends and family thought he seemed different, more agitated after he came back.
And I don't think that anybody yet has said, oh, we know that's Lariam, but it certainly warrants further exploration.
The drug's maker, Hoffman LaRoche, insists Lariam is safe and says side effects are rare. But as more and more reports of problems surface, an increasing number of people are wondering which is more dangerous, the disease or the drug that prevents it. Cynthia Bowers, CBS News, Chicago.
Now an update on a story that we have been following from the beginning, the murders of military spouses at Fort Bragg. Sunday, the Army is going to be sending a 16-member medical investigation team to the base. And one intriguing possibility they'll be looking at, the possible role of an anti-malaria drug that's been known to cause profound changes in behavior. U.S. soldiers came home from Afghanistan to a hero's welcome and tears of joy. But joy turned to sorrow at Fort Bragg when a series of killings involving soldiers and their wives rocked the base. On June 11th, 2 days after returning from Afghanistan, Sergeant First Class Rigoberto Nieves shot his wife Teresa and then himself. Over the next 5 weeks, there were 3 more murders. Brandon Floyd of the elite Delta Force shot and killed his wife Andrea and then himself. Master Sergeant William Wright allegedly strangled his wife Jennifer. And Sergeant Cedric Griffin, the only one who had not been to Afghanistan, allegedly stabbed his estranged wife Marilyn. An Army medical team is now investigating why these crimes happened. One thing they're looking at, a possible link between the anti-malaria drug Lariam and the murders. Some say the drug is dangerous.
The most recent studies show that Lariam causes neuropsychiatric side effects in a third of the people who take the drug. And these side effects can be paranoia, suicidal behavior, psychotic actions.
But the Army is still skeptical of a connection. At Fort Bragg, shocked military families are hoping the Army can come up with some answers and do something to prevent such tragedies from happening ever again. And we should point out that Hoffman LaRoche, which makes Lariam, says the drug is safe, maintains stoutly that the drug is all right and that serious side effects are rare.
We have an update now on a story that we reported here last night for you about the possible role of a controversial drug in a series of domestic murders at Fort Bragg, home of the Army Special Forces Unit. Cynthia Bowers is following the story and joins us now live with the latest. Cynthia?
John, the Army has suddenly put the Fort Bragg murder investigations on the hot seat. The military is sending what amounts to a medical SWAT team to North Carolina this weekend. Included in the investigation is whether the anti-malarial drug Lariam was a factor.
Consider the case of William Wright. He was one of 3 Fort Bragg soldiers who reportedly took Lariam in Afghanistan and then came home and allegedly killed their wives.
Bill was not a guy that you would suspect.
When Johnny Lowndes, who served with Wright, heard about the murder, he immediately wondered about Lariam. As a medic, he had dispensed the drug. It was in Haiti back in the mid-90s that he first noticed the problem with side effects.
It was common knowledge that with the night sweats and the vivid dreams, and it also intensified a personality. If a guy was tending to be down, he was going to be more down. If he was quiet, he was going to be anxious.
Lowndes' wife Debbie knew enough to tiptoe around her husband when he was taking Lariam and heard enough stories from other wives at Fort McPherson to feel she had to alert Army officials. This was in 1996.
I was getting very concerned, and as I talked with team wives about it, they also were recognizing the same things, and some of them worse than my husband's.
The drug's manufacturer, Hoffman LaRoche, acknowledges side effects in rare cases and says no medication is completely free of adverse effects. However, it's important to note Lariam is not associated with violent criminal conduct. The Army says, simply put, Lariam saves soldiers serving in places like Somalia and Afghanistan, and the benefits far outweigh the risks.
We have found that for most soldiers, this is the drug that they're able to handle very well, and even those side effects that some may have had, for the most part, have been minor.
But other nations feel differently. Australia, for example, no longer gives its military Lariam, and the opponents of the drug here feel any investigation into Lariam is long overdue.
You didn't stab anybody?
No.
Did you know anybody had been stabbed?
No.
That's right, he didn't stab anybody. But Brandon Hine is in prison for life, guilty of murder, even though the judge, the jury, and the prosecutors all know the stabbing was done by Brandon's friend, Jason Holland.
I didn't mean to kill him, and I never did. But he died. I can't give it back, but I took responsibility for it. I thought that was the right thing to do. And they got my brother and my 2 buddies. And we're all doing life now. And they're doing life for something they didn't do.
It was supposed to be a dream vacation, a safari to Kenya for Dr. Robert Daler and his wife Jane. But deep in the African bush, she suddenly transformed before his eyes.
She just became completely psychotic in the van. Started taking her clothes off, and they had a doctor at this lodge that came into the van, and she said, "Did she take Lariam?"
Lariam is a common medication given to more than 5 million Americans. What the Dalers didn't know was how bad the side effects could be until Jane was flown home, strapped to her seat with a bed sheet.
I thought that people were trying to kill me all the time. I thought that my family was going to be killed.
Last summer, 4 soldiers from Fort Bragg were accused of killing their wives. 2 of the men committed suicide. The other 2 are awaiting trial. So many brutal crimes, so similar, so close in time, raised questions, and the Army sent a team to investigate. Some people at Fort Bragg were suspicious right from the start that the anti-malarial drug Lariam may have played a part in the murders. Lariam was invented by the U.S. Army and is routinely given to soldiers deployed overseas. But Lariam can cause what are called neuropsychiatric adverse events. In plain language, it can cause you to lose your mind. No one questions Lariam's effectiveness in preventing the deadly disease malaria. Millions of tourists and other world travelers have taken it with no problem. But a significant number of people have seen and felt firsthand the dark side of Lariam.
Oh, look at all those over there, too.
It was supposed to be a dream vacation, a safari to Kenya a year and a half ago for Dr. Robert Daler and his wife Jane, seen here on home video. What you won't see is how deep in the African bush she suddenly transformed before his eyes.
She just became completely psychotic in the van. Started taking her clothes off. She had called people back from the dead, and they had a doctor at this lodge that came into the van, and she looked at Jane, and she said, "Did she take Lariam?" She said she'd seen this in many Americans.
So had 3 other doctors in Africa who confirmed the diagnosis. Jane Daler was flown home, strapped to her seat with a bed sheet. But home meant a month in a psychiatric hospital, in and out of psychosis with terrifying hallucinations.
They were horrific. I thought that people were trying to kill me all the time. I thought that my family was going to be killed.
According to its own internal documents, Roche Pharmaceuticals, Lariam's maker, has received over 3,000 reports of psychiatric problems associated with the drug, from nightmares, depression, and hallucinations to paranoia, psychosis, and aggression. But could Lariam lead to something worse? That was the question raised last summer when this man, Master Sergeant William Wright, and 3 other Fort Bragg soldiers were accused of killing their wives, all within a period of about 6 weeks. We know for a fact that Wright and another soldier were given Lariam, and Wright is considering using that as part of his defense. One of his fellow Green Berets thinks Lariam did play a role. John Lown, now an ordained minister, visits Wright in jail every week.
When you first started to see him, what was he like?
He was very confused. He was very paranoid. And, I was like, this is not the Bill that I knew.
And how is he now compared with when he first went into jail?
About the 5th week after that, he was coherent. He was fine. He even said, well, I'm thinking a lot better now.
What do you think has caused this change?
Personally, I think it was the medication. It took about 2 months for the stuff to clear out of your system.
Lown says his unit even had names for the days they took Lariam, Manic Mondays or Wild Wednesdays. His wife Debbie says she and the other wives would see an immediate change in the men.
What kinds of symptoms did they tell you they saw?
That their husbands were very negative, aggressive. A couple of them even complained how they would be woke in the middle of the night, shook, called names. One running down the street without his clothes on, hollering, screaming.
But how do you know it's not just the stress of what they were under job-wise?
He's been on other deployments where Lariam was not required and didn't have those kind of problems.
Like her husband, Debbie Lown is convinced Lariam was a factor in some of the Fort Bragg murders. She had even complained to military authorities as far back as 1996.
And I said, I'm not asking you to stop giving them the Lariam. I'm just asking you to better inform the soldiers of what they're taking. Tell their wives, because they'll save marriages that way. They'll save lives that way.
Jane Daler agrees just knowing it's the Lariam can make all the difference.
If it wasn't for him, I honestly think that somebody could have put me in a mental institution and thrown away the key.
Before the trip, her husband Bob, a physician, says he was careful since his wife had been treated for depression in the past and was on what he says was a low preventative dose of Prozac. He checked with a travel clinic, the Centers for Disease Control website, and his physician's drug guide. This is what he read. Information written by drug companies for doctors and approved by the Food and Drug Administration. The key part is the warning section. That's what doctors pay attention to.
And this one for Lariam says Lariam should not be prescribed in patients with active depression or with a history of psychosis or convulsions.
Right. And
You read
Jane
that
did-
before you left?
Yeah, that's what I read. And Jane did not have active depression. She did not. That was 10 years earlier. She did not have psychosis ever. She never had seizures. Nor did I. There was no reason why either of us couldn't take this drug.
But what was not in the warning section, what may have raised a red flag for the Dalers, are those disturbing side effects: depression, hallucinations, psychotic or paranoid reactions, aggression, all listed towards the end.
They buried the lead. They took the important information that would have tipped off a doctor and stuck it down there in a part that's not part of the warnings.
Attorneys Bernard Fishman and Paul Smith represent the Dalers in a lawsuit they filed against Roche, arguing that the company failed to properly warn them.
But can't Roche argue, we have it in here. We tell you there are less frequently adverse events, depression, hallucinations, psychotic episodes.
It doesn't call any attention to the real nature of this problem.